Welcome to Bible Over Brews, deep thoughts fermented over time and text. We come to you tonight, George,
Yo,
Gumby,
What's up?
Steve,
Hey!
and Brian Godawa.
Hoo-ha!
We're going to be talking all about his new book, which I'm very excited to read. But first, Steve, you brought us a beer?
Yes, I did. I have Ryan Gost, Cougar Blonde. It's a blonde ale. So Ryan Gost is out of Cincinnati, Ohio, and I was able to get it. We have a new grocery store in the area called Lucky's, and that's where I got it at. So
Awesome. I look forward to that. We featured Rheingeist once or twice before. So far, it's been pleasant each time. So, there you go, Steve.
have you trying it? We haven't.
Has there been a beer we haven't liked?
Well, you and Mike, I don't think liked the tarts too much.
Oh, yeah, that was...
there was that lemon one that wasn't that.
Which I thought it was okay.
Yeah, and I'm glad you got a blonde because it's like super hot out. So yeah, I didn't want a dark, thick porter like beer. So a lighter beer will hit the spot better today.
Yeah, I think they're all nice and light tonight. So,
Okay.
cheers.
Cheers.
Yes.
And I'm drinking Wild Turkey Rye Whiskey Blonde.
Oh,
Yeah.
we are familiar with
Blonde whiskey.
Yes, I actually tend to keep a little wild turkey in my fridge here and there.
Puts hair in your chest
Yes, it does.
Or takes it off.
or takes it off. Means you're a real man. Like wild turkey.
Yeah, this is actually really smooth. This is nice.
Not bad.
It's light.
Perfect for today.
It's good for today. I'm putting it as like an average
Yeah.
light blonde.
I'm going to say as a hot summer beer day.
There you go.
Yeah. It's good for hot weather.
Am I the only person that's going to be the one to say this and say I don't mind like a fruity beer on a summer day? Has anyone else like follow the line, Kugels?
Yeah.
No one wants to admit that on the radio.
Mike Donahue does.
Yeah. He does.
Does he?
Yes, he does.
No one else? Me and Mike only?
Yeah. No, I actually...
No, guys. I mean, I'm such a man. It's either, just straight up beer, Budweiser, All-American, or whiskey.
Not here,
That's it.
sir. Not here, man.
No. I actually really like Not Your Father's Root Beer, and actually that whole line.
It is good, and they're strong.
Yeah. So, no, I'll admit to enjoying some of the offshoots.
Okay. Thank you, Juice.
You're welcome.
You guys left me hanging. I hate you guys.
But I like the mango infused
Thank you.
habanero that
Masthead.
Mastheads has.
Wow,
Yeah,
did you
that's
hear that,
amazing.
Brian?
Yeah.
That was for real.
For all you people in the
Yeah, they
the
blow
audience,
up dynamite.
that's the fireworks in the background. We're entering the 4th of July. Not quite there yet, but a couple of days, and so my street loves fireworks. And that's what you hear in the background.
So, Brian, with your whiskey or bourbon, I think you had bourbon last time, right?
Yeah. You guys bought me some last time. It was fantastic.
Oh, thank you.
Oh, that was from the Cleveland whiskey company.
No, that was the Cleveland
Yeah.
whiskey.
Yeah.
Great company.
Yeah, it was good.
Do you
They
like to
hand-delivered
mix
it.
any of your drinks, or are you just straight up?
Just straight, yeah.
Okay.
Simple.
Man stuff.
I like mine on the
Yeah.
rocks.
Yeah, but the secret...
Sometimes, yeah.
My wife's boss said the secret to bourbon is that you only use one ice cube when you do it on the rocks.
Yeah.
Yeah, if
Otherwise,
you're
it
fancy, you get
dilutes
the
it.
big block cube in there, or the big circle cube. It's a big one.
Yeah. Have you seen that?
Yes.
Right. That it's purposely made so that way very little of the water melts into it.
Yeah, I like that. It's cool. Because I do like cold, but I've started just putting it in the freezer anyway, so it's cold when it comes out.
Awesome.
There you go.
Yeah.
So just get to the point. I like it.
Yeah. Exactly.
So let's hear about Resistant Revolt of the Jews.
Well, let me tell you, talk about fireworks. We'll have some fireworks with this show if people are listening, because as we talked about last time, I have some controversial views with the dominant view in America of many Christians about the end times, right? And last time I was on the show, I think I don't know, did we? I don't know if we talked about the second book, Remnant, but I know we talked about Tyrant. I'm pretty sure.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, I'm writing a series called Chronicles of the Apocalypse, and the third book is called Resistant: Revolt of the Jews. And the series is basically, I call it the origin story of the Book of Revelation. So that, there's a lot of books out there these days with people who are speculating on how they think Revelation might be fulfilled in our future, and the mark of the beast, and how it applies to like modern day microchips and transhumanism and alien disclosure. There's this whole, basically a whole world of big money selling stuff.
Yeah.
And I don't begrudge them that, because I do believe they believe in it. But nevertheless, basically the view that most Christians have is roughly the Left Behind view. We all know that, or different variations on that theme. And but there are a couple other schools of thought that have a long scholarly pedigree and history. And one of them is Amillennialism, which tends to interpret the Book of Revelation rather than like the normal premillennial or dispensational view. That is the Left Behind view, right? That's the typical view that sort of believes we are probably in the end times right now, the last days, and sometime soon the Christians will be raptured, and there will start a 7-year tribulation, and a world ruler will rise up to save everybody, but he's really the Antichrist, and make a covenant with Israel and rebuild the temple, and and then turn out to be, wanting to control the world and all this stuff. And that's sort of the typical, and then Christ returns to destroy it all. And that's sort of the typical, what I would call, for ease of discussion, a futurist view. Mm-hmm. And again, like I said, that's the dominant view. But there are other views, and a lot of Christians haven't been educated on this. I wasn't many, many years ago. And when I discovered that the typical Left Behind view was just one of several views, with, like I said, a pedigree of scholarship within Orthodox Christianity, I got mad because they held it back. They just said, no, this is just what the Bible says, and they sort of hid the other views from me. Yeah. And when I started experiencing some of the anomalies and some of the tension points of this viewpoint, for example, they've been saying this for decades, that the end was near, and when Israel became a nation, within one generation, all these things would happen. And I remember even Hal Lindsey and Chuck Smith, other famous men, saying that Christ was going to return, or the rapture was going to happen within the 1980s. Mm-hmm. And these men were not held accountable because they continued on in their ministries when they were wrong. And anyway, this has been going on for years, and every 5 to 10 years, when the geopolitics of the world changes, their interpretations change. And so now, you have Islam is at the heart of it, and some people are saying, well, there's still people who believe that the Antichrist is going to be the Pope for Roman Catholic Church, and some who say, oh no, it's going to be a Muslim, and some say no, it's going to be a Jew. So their theories are always changing. That was one of the things that sort of really bothered me. Yeah. It took time to really see that, though, because you're in this time period, and you don't really, unless you do research to find out what they said in the past. And now that stuff is available. You can go back and read Hal Lindsey's most famous, sold 35, 40 million books, more than anything in Christian history. It was right up there with the Bible, right? Mm-hmm. And this was this book talking about this stuff, and none of it happened.
None.
And this man was a false prophet, and yet he still is around today. Yeah. So that was the kind of stuff that bothered me, as well as the fact that I started hearing these other views that I initially reacted to as being heresy, because that's what I was taught. But then I found out, no, godly men have held these things. And one of the views is Amillennialism, and that tends to interpret Revelation as that's more in an idealistic sense, where it sort of describes history in a general way, and it applies to many different times in history. So it's more of a generic prophecy, not necessarily specific. But many godly and scholarly men have held that view. And then there's also the postmillennial view, or and the postmillennial view is more is more preteristic, and Amils can be preterist too. And that view is what I now support, which is the preterist view. And the preterist basically means the past. It's a Latin word that means the past. And what that really means is, whereas most Christians would believe that the last days in the Bible means the last days of the earth or of history, and that's in our futurist. My view, preterist, believes no, the last days happened in the past, but they were the last days of the old covenant, not of time and history.
Right.
And so, in other words, it's like the language that we automatically assume when we read the Bible as American modern Westerners. We read last days and we just impose our own subjective meaning on it rather than saying, well, let's find out what did it mean to the ancient world when they used this language and these words, you know? And so, so that's kind of my viewpoint and understanding, and starting to see how a lot of what the Bible says, including the book of Revelation, is really not about the end of the world judgment, but it's more about the judgment on first century Jerusalem for killing Messiah. And it also marks the end of the old covenant and the institution of the new covenant kingdom. And so that's sort of the heart and soul of it. That's the big picture of how I understand it. And of course, many Christians, you know, when you hear this, you know, you're going to have lots of questions from your own viewpoint. But what about this? What about that? Right? And trust me, they all have answers. Now, look, every system has holes, and I may be wrong, and I'm always open. I've held all the views at some point in my life: dispensational, amillennial, premillennial. And so I know what it's like, and I think we all need to be humble. But nevertheless, my view is a minority view, but it is a growing view. And I think it's probably one of the fastest growing views in the church. And I think one of the reasons why is we are now 2 generations past Israel becoming a nation. And so much of the future, not all, but a lot of the futurist sort of claims were that everything's going to end within a generation, because Jesus said this generation will not pass away.
Yeah.
And so most people assume that's the generation that sees Israel becoming a nation. Well, it's 2 generations now, folks. How much longer do you need before you start to say, maybe the system should be questioned and let's consider something else? And so, so that's kind of the world that we live in. So I'm a minority view. So I'm trying to express this, get the word out. And I thought one of the best ways of doing it was to really continue the series that I had already been writing for the last 6 years, as we talked about on your show, Chronicles of the Nephilim. And Chronicles of the Nephilim was more about like the Old Testament coming up to the New Testament, and how, you know, there's the odd things in the Bible, whether it's the Nephilim or the Watchers, you know, and how did that all come into play with the coming gospel and Messiah. But I finished it in the New Testament, and I realized as I was writing this that, you know, Jesus was, in his parables and in his teaching, he was saying a lot about how, look, this adulterous generation is going to reject me. And in Matthew 23, he talks about how all the blood of all the prophets who've been slain in Israel will be upon this generation. Why? Because you will crucify the Messiah. You will kill Messiah. So yeah, if you kill if you kill God in the flesh, if you kill the most important prophet of all, you're going to have the blood of everybody on you, right? And that's kind of what Jesus was saying in Matthew 23, really plainly. I mean, this isn't something I'm making up, you know? Oh, yeah. So if you want to call Jesus an anti-Semite, go ahead and be my guest. But Jesus was condemning the first generation, not all generations. And why? Because they would kill the Messiah, and that makes sense, right? But then he also said, because of that, your house will be left to you desolate. And that's in Matthew 24, verse 1 and 2, I think. And why? What does that mean? You know, and the point of it is the house which was the temple of God, that was the incarnation of the old covenant. Yeah. And so it makes sense that if God is bringing in the new covenant and he's getting rid of the old covenant, well, then it makes sense that he would get rid of the historical, earthly incarnation of that old covenant, right? And that's what the destruction of the temple and Jerusalem in AD 70. That's why it's so crucial and important to understanding Christianity. We stop after the book of Acts because that's where the book of Acts ends. The Bible roughly ends. Of course, there is Revelation, and that's my argument. But nevertheless, I mean, most Christians stop at Acts, and I get that. We don't know what happened from Book of Acts to which is around ended around AD 52 or something like that, and then in the next 20 years or so, there was 20-30 years. It led up to a revolt by the Jews against Rome, you know, and they were expecting Messiah to come and save them. So they rose up in revolt, and there was a war. Nero Caesar sent his armies over to subdue all of Israel and destroy it all, basically, and destroy the temple. And they ultimately did that, and that's what happened in AD 70. And so that's an event that I thought it's so important to understanding not just Judaism, because it ended Judaism, right? And
Yeah.
after that, Judaism became a different religion. They no longer have, what's the old Torah? Torah is all about the temple and the sacrifices. Well, they don't have a temple, so they're no longer a Torah religion.
Right.
They give it lip service, but they're not. So it changed Judaism into something different than the Bible, but it also changed Christianity, because from that point, Christianity broke off from Judaism. It grew out of Judaism, the Messiah of the Jews, but then God brought in the Gentiles, and that bringing in the Gentiles made it a more universal scope. But they were still stuck because Jerusalem was still there and the temple was still there.
Yeah.
And so once it was destroyed, Christianity then just grew out and just covered the earth and such. And so that's sort of the big picture story that has impressed me, that I wanted to tell that war with the Jews and how Rome came in. And we hear about Christians being thrown to the lions under Nero Caesar. I tell all that in this series, and I wanted to tell the historical time period from about AD 64, which was the start, the Great Fire of Rome, when Rome was burned down, and then Nero blamed the Christians in order to persecute them, and that started the first great persecution, which I argue is what the Bible calls the Great Tribulation, and then that ultimately leads up to the destruction of Jerusalem and such. So I wanted to tell that story. I wanted to tell the history of it. So I've done massive research. I try to keep it very consistent. And the first book, Tyrant, talked about the rise of Nero, and like I said, not the rise, but the Great Fire of Rome, and how Nero sort of affected Christianity and went after Christianity. And I also talk about the martyrdoms of Paul and Peter in Rome, and some of those traumatic effects that we have legends of, but we're not entirely sure of, right? So I wanted to tell that story. And then what happened was I thought, well, I don't want to just do, I can do the theology, and I've got a theological book about this as well called End Times Bible Prophecy. But prophecy can be a very complex thing, and a lot of Christians it can be overwhelming, or it's just too much. I don't want to get caught up in all that. Yeah. I understand. Some Christians, it's just hard to follow because it can get very deep. So what I wanted to do was I wanted to put that into a story form, make it entertaining, so that Christians will enjoy it, and they'll draw something from it theologically if they want to, but they'll also learn about the historical events, right? So that was sort of my intent behind the whole series. And so far, it's going really well. All the books are usually in the top 10, depending on what day it is. They're usually in the top 10 of biblical fiction on Amazon. Yep. And the second book was, okay, so here was the premise of the story. You start with Nero, the ultimate bad guy. He's tyrant, right? And he finds out that there's this subversive letter that's being passed around the empire. And it talks about the end of the world and the assassination of Caesar, right? So he's going, what? So he gets a Roman warrior, and he gives him the commission, go and find this letter and find who's writing it and kill him.
That's Severus, right?
Yeah, that's Severus, right? So, and then the Severus is the Roman, and he happens to have a Jewish doctor who's his servant, and then he has a Christian woman who's a slave. So these three go on this journey of trying to track it down, and of course, there's obviously all kind of political things going on because what? Oh, go ahead.
No worries. I just wanted to ask you a question about when you said this woman's a slave. Can you help me define slave?
Oh, here we go.
Yeah, that's a good question because, of course, in Rome, the understanding, and in ancient world, the understanding of slavery is not the way we understand slavery. When we think of slavery, it's the antebellum South,
right?
And it's usually race-based, and it's usually white people enslaving black people. But slavery was a more generic term and certainly in the Roman Empire, which could include anything from a indentured servant to an actual slave who, they were born and raised within a slave household, and so they don't really have their freedom. But I think it's more akin to what we would call servanthood, and there's just different levels of protection that you might have. So in the end, sometimes servants could actually buy their freedom. Sometimes servants were let go because their masters, for whatever reason. Sometimes they were captured from other nations, right? So there's a wide variety of what slaves are. But at that particular time, I have the Christian was, because the Christians were blamed for doing this to Rome, then they were fair game. People were killing them and stuff, and you could also take them as slaves. And in fact, becoming a slave might save you, because otherwise you'd be thrown to the lions. And that's kind of what happens in my story.
Yeah.
Is that along the lines of what you were?
Yeah, I've been going on and on with Juice about this since I think I joined the podcast. So I guess I was just wanting to get another, a brilliant mind like yourself to help me argue with Juice a little more, but I'll save it for another podcast. Thank you, my friend.
Well, I'll certainly acknowledge that. I think it's a lot of things are complex issues when you're looking back and interpreting the ancient world, and we do it so much through our own eyes, and so we just have to be careful. My goal is to try to seek to understand it within their context, and that means, that means trying to understand first how they understood it rather than imposing our own understanding upon it. So in general, even slavery in the Bible is not the same as what we think of it. And I think it's closer to indentured servitude most of the time.
So, Brian, I have a question. You said that Nero blamed the Christians for the fire. But it almost is that actually what happened? Were the Christians actually to blame for the Great Fire of Rome?
I don't believe so. And we do have some slight references to it historically in writers like Suetonius and Tacitus, who were Roman historians. And basically, no one knows for sure, but there are a couple theories. And one of the theories, which I think is actually the strongest because it seems to fit the evidence best, is, well, let me think if there's another theory. Well, obviously one theory would be that the Christians did it. But the other theory is the dominant one, which is basically, okay, so there's two. One is that behind all this, Nero had consciously and specifically spoken of his desire to rebuild Rome in his image and call it Neronia.
Right.
So everyone knew, and he even had plans drawn up. And so the theory is that they do see where it might have started somewhere around the Colosseum in the marketplace, and it just blew out. But they don't necessarily know who started it, but it could have happened because these marketplaces are just full of stuff, and and I think it was like a place that sold lamps, so it's logical in that sense, and they did try to stop it. They had everyone's out there, but the problem is that there is some evidence made by some of the historians that they may have seen some people deliberately trying to start some of Roman guards and stuff sort of encouraging the fires in certain places and sort of starting them in other places, at least there's some eyewitnesses of that. But to counter that, there is what they call backfires, which is sometimes you would actually want to start a fire before so it would stop the fire coming, right? So there's arguments on both sides in that sense. And then, but lastly, the main idea is that either it started and Nero was not even there. He was 40 miles away, engaging in a musical competition. That doesn't mean he didn't order it, but that's just the fact, right? So either it started and it was beneficial to his own plans, and so either he let it go, or it just got out of control because the winds were really bad. There's a lot of facts that show that it really did, they don't know how it started, but it got out of control and they tried to stop it and they couldn't, and it burned down through 2/3 of Rome. Wow. So my basic theory is that he either ordered it, he probably ordered it done by someone and made sure that it would happen so that he could have it rebuilt as Neronia in his image. And then being out of town during that time was, part of the plan of, hey, he's not around, so how could he have been part of it, right? Yeah. And that's of course a weak evidence, but it's still helpful for his cause, right? And because in fact he did end up rebuilding Rome, but he didn't call it Neronia. So so my theory is that the last thing I neglected to say was the problem was if the populace started spreading gossip and rumors that he did this because they knew he was talking about Neronia, right? So, and the reality is it doesn't matter if you're Caesar and you're considered God. If the people rise up as a mob, they kill Caesars all the time, right? So The problem is that if the mob grew and said he did this to us for his own glory, they would have killed him. So he did need a scapegoat. And I have another part of my theory based on my research that Josephus was in Rome at that time. He was supposed to be there for, trying to get some priests that were in trouble for some reason, from priests from Israel who were in prison. So he happened to be there at the time. And Nero's emperor's wife, Poppaea, was not necessarily, was kind of like what they call a God-fearer. She was very open and very positive to Judaism. She wasn't a convert because she didn't follow it, but she loved it. And Nero had a couple of other famous Jewish people that he, including a mime that he really, really liked. And Josephus is there at that time. And so I think that Josephus was part of this, sort of group of the inner circle of people. Yeah. Suggesting the Christians, because it fits so perfectly, right? Christians are saying God's going to come and judge the world with fire, judge the land with fire and all this. And so it fit perfectly, but it would also help the Jews to get Nero's eyes off of the Jews and onto the Christians. Even though the Christians many of them were Jews, they were still considered separate at that time. Yeah. And so that was a way to kill. Brian. Yeah, it was a way to kill one bird with two stones.
Exactly. That's what I was wondering. I mean, it seems like at the birth of Christianity, if you can get it right at the head and have the Christians blamed for that, cui bono at Judaism.
Yeah.
So and this is just me thinking out loud, like, man, how did just a group of people, as the Christians, get blamed for that? And
yeah, absolutely. And I have all that in my books. In the first book, Tyrant, I deal with all of that stuff. And it's just really interesting, fascinating history. And I try to be as historically accurate as possible while also bringing a supernatural Christian worldview. So I have, in this series of novels, I have the Watchers, I have the Gods of the Nations, which is an idea that I carry over from Chronicles of the Nephilim. And for your hearers who may not be familiar with that, the notion is that in the book of Deuteronomy, it's all over the Old Testament, but this is something a lot of Christians aren't aware of. But in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 32, verses 8 through 10, it talks about how God says at the Tower of Babel incident, when God separated the tongues and stuff, it says that he separated the nations, and he separated them according to the number of the sons of God, which I argue is they are supernatural beings from God's counsel that came to earth. That's another debate, or another issue, but
good one.
So he numbers them, the Gentile nations, according to the sons of God, but Jacob I will keep for my inheritance. So there's this notion of God is divvying out earthly territories to the Gentile nations, and we know that, according to the Bible, at least in that worldview, they believed in 70 nations in Genesis 10. So there's 70 nations that are under the authority of these fallen sons of God, who they then worship as false gods, right? And then God says, but I will keep my people, Jacob, for myself, and Israel will be their land. And so it's this notion that God places under the authority of fallen watchers, false gods. He places all the Gentile nations who then worship them. And that's why you have this notion throughout the whole Old Covenant about this very thing where, there's so many examples of it, but nevertheless, the idea is that in Psalm 82, you read about how God will judge these gods of the nations, and he will do it when Messiah comes, because when Messiah comes, what will happen? Messiah, Psalm 2, Messiah will inherit the nations, right? Yeah. The Son of God comes, and why? Because the nations were actually, their territories were under the authority of God, of other gods, but Messiah comes and takes back that territory, and therefore no longer will God's people just be one people on one piece of land, but now men and women from every tribe of every nation and every tongue can now come into the kingdom of God. That's what Messiah does, right? So my understanding is that when Messiah comes, he accomplishes that amazing feat, and so I actually write about that in the Chronicles of the Apocalypse series. So I have these spirit beings. I sort of show the human side, and then I show the spiritual side, and it's speculative, but nonetheless, I try to keep it theologically accurate.
Nice. Yeah, I love the fact that you carry over the characters from Chronicles of Nephilim. You know, the angels, and then also some of the Watchers as well.
Yeah, this series is a standalone. You can read Chronicles of the Apocalypse starting with Tyrant. There's going to be 4. There's 3 written now. But you're right. All the spiritual beings I've carried over from the previous series, so you would actually learn a lot. There's a lot that is in Apocalypse that I refer to in Nephilim, but I try to explain it so you don't need to have read Chronicles of the Nephilim. But yeah, so I've got those things, and you've got this journey with these heroes, and what happens is they ultimately find out what this letter is. It's the letter of Revelation. And they find John on Patmos, and they find out what it really means. And what they come to understand it as is, John explains to them, no, this is a letter not of judgment upon Rome, of the nations, but of judgment upon Israel, upon Jerusalem. And therefore, it says basically that the armies of Rome are going to come down and destroy everything, because Jesus said, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, know her end is near, right? And so they have to get the message to the Christians. And then I talk about the journey of going to Jerusalem, trying to persuade the Christians, it's happening, get out. Right. And so that's remnant, and the remnant are the Jewish believers in Jerusalem that God wants to save before he destroys the city.
Yeah. And that kind of hits Alexander a lot in that book when he's seeing what Revelation actually is.
What do you mean by Alexander?
Oh, it really hits him.
The hero.
Yeah, it really starts hitting him once he realizes what the letter actually is.
Yes, Alexander is my Jewish doctor, and he starts out on a character journey from being basically a Jew who compromises in order to be, he's a Hellenistic Jew, which means he wants to compromise and have both his Jewish heritage and the Roman, Greco-Roman sort of, status and that kind of a thing. And then he, like you said, he gets faced because of his Jewishness. He understands what's going on in the Christian community, and it pulls him toward that into a very powerful, confrontation with his spirituality, shall we say?
Really cool.
I thought it was well done.
So if I can, keep dominating this discussion. So Resistant is the 3rd book, and that is where I start to bring out now the Jews are revolting against Rome. And by the way, people might be asking, well, where'd you get all this information? And there's really one dominant source that we have about this event of the fall of the Roman armies coming and destroying Israel and Jerusalem. And it's basically called Wars of the Jews by Josephus. Yeah. Right. And so that's where I'm getting all my history stuff from. And so the next book, Resistant, Revolt of the Jews, I focus in on how this revolt of the Jews rises up. They think Messiah is going to help us. And I have Rome coming in and starting to take over the territory of Israel, leading up to the siege of Jerusalem. But that's going to happen in the last book, right? So that's kind of what this book is about. Meanwhile, our hero, which is now our heroes, is Alexander, the Jewish guy, and the Christian woman. He's a doctor, and he gets the conviction that he wants to go into the city of Jerusalem, knowing that this stuff is going to happen, but he has a compassionate transformation in his heart, and he wants to go and risk his life and to try to be a doctor and help the wounded, because there's so many innocent people in Jerusalem that are going to be, killed and hurt by this attack, right? So he goes into the heart of it with this Christian woman, and they now are seeing inside Jerusalem what's happening as everything is starting to fall apart. And this is where my viewpoint comes in. I bring in the 2 witnesses who come and start prophesying. And so this is one of those cases where people think, well, that's in our future, but I actually think the 2 witnesses were something that occurred in Jerusalem at that time. Yeah. Were they literal or were they more metaphorical? I think they could be both. I don't know for sure, but I'm writing a fascinating theological story, so I'm making them out to be individuals who symbolically represent the law and the prophets, Moses and Elijah. And many scholars say this anyway, that they are symbolic. Yeah. And so they represent why? Why is that? Because the law and the prophets was the Torah. And that was condemning. So let's put it this way. if God is going to destroy the old covenant and bring in the new covenant, right? And he's going to destroy the people who rejected him. God is a God of law, right? So what does he do? He does things according to law. And if you're going to engage in capital punishment on a criminal, you must have at least 2 witnesses. So those are the 2 witnesses, and the law and the prophets condemn them because why? Because they rejected Messiah. And so then he's going to destroy them, and that's the harlot is the unfaithful wife, and he's going to remarry a new bride of Christ. And that's sort of the picture of what's going on in there, and that's what happens. And so I have the 2 witnesses in there going around, and they're starting to bring forth the prophecies of all the plagues and all the things that are going to fall upon the people. So that's kind of what happens in Resistant. And like I said, if you're at least open-minded enough to say, what might another view look like? This will help you see how Revelation could possibly be understood as happening in the first century within their own context, and will make it feel very, very germane, very sensible. Oh, that makes sense, Yeah. I really think it does that for people.
Yeah.
So Brian, I got a question for you as well. And I know this gets misinterpreted among even cults and things like that as well. The 144,000, you think that would be the people who were in Israel at the time, that were in Jerusalem at the time, that were the remnant, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the argument that I make in my book Remnant, actually, is that if you look at the 144,000, first of all, this is another thing.
Because they are Jews.
They are Jews, right. But the number 144,000 is an obvious symbol, so it doesn't have to be a literal number.
Right.
It's 12,000 of 12 tribes of Israel,
correct.
Right? It's the number of perfection and all that. So, yeah, I actually think that and I'm following Ken Gentry's interpretation here, that I believe that those 144,000 are the remnant. And who are the remnant in the Old Testament? They're always the true believers inside apostate Israel. Whenever
correct.
Israel was apostate, God always said, but I have my remnant. Well, in the first century, Jews as a nation were apostate because they killed Messiah, but there was a remnant of Jews who did believe Messiah.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, we know that. And those are the remnant that he wanted to get out of the city that he was going to protect. And sure enough, we have a basic historical references that through Eusebius and a couple of other historians that say the Christians in Jerusalem, when the Roman armies were coming down, they fled to Pella because they had this prophecy from Jesus, right?
Yes.
So that's who I believe is the symbolic representation. It may have actually been close to 145. I don't know, but it's
a symbolic number, which yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
That was a great point about the 2 witnesses and the fact that how it correlates to actual judgment being placed upon Jerusalem. I've never ever thought to even make that connection. Because you're right, it would be a lawful event, not just something done out of.
Yeah, God doesn't just operate vindictively, right? He does things legally. And so here's just for your listeners too, keep your eyes open. Go to Godawa.com and sign up for my updates, because this year a Revelation commentary is coming out that's going to change the evangelical landscape. I've already read it twice, and it's by Ken Gentry, and it's called The Divorce of Israel.
Nice.
And it's a redemptive historical preterist commentary on the book of Revelation. And I'm following his basic ideas in there. And I lost my track of thought where I was going with that. You mentioned the 2 witnesses. The judge. So the name of the book, the name of the 2-volume series is called The Divorce of Israel. And his argument is God divorces the ethnic geopolitical nation of Israel, not the remnant, but he does reject the nation as a whole. Why? Because they killed Messiah. So he's going to divorce them. But divorce always required a certificate of divorce, right?
Right. Yep.
God gave that in his law. So when you see Jesus with the 7-sealed scroll, who can open it? The argument is that's the scroll of divorce. And so Revelation itself is sort of the scroll of divorce, that God is declaring, these are the reasons why I'm divorcing you. And these are the judgments you're going to experience. Here's my 2 witnesses. Now I'm going to engage in capital punishment. Then I'm going to marry my new bride, which is the bride of Christ. Who's that? Well, it's
church.
Christian believers.
Yeah.
Which is Jew and Gentile who believe, right?
Right.
And that includes both the remnant and the Gentiles from every nation.
Yeah.
So when you see in Revelation 21, when you see the new Jerusalem coming out of heaven, another, it's hard for me not to be sarcastic or polemical, but if it isn't obvious that that's symbolic to you, you really have a problem of Bible interpretation, because it's clearly symbolic. There's no way in earth that some city 12 miles high into the atmosphere. It's ridiculous. God does miracles, but he doesn't do absurdities, right?
Yeah. I mean, the Revelation itself states it's a book of visions.
Yeah, exactly. In verse 1 it says the angel gave this vision to John of the things that shall shortly come to pass, not thousands of years from now, but shortly. And then he says these things were signified to John. The word for signified in Greek is semiosis, which is symbol. So yes, there are actual historical reference in symbolism, but when you say symbolism, that doesn't mean it's just doesn't mean anything. No, it means that there are symbols that represent something actually in history. And so consequently, the New Jerusalem, but the thing is the New Jerusalem coming out of heaven is not something new. It's all over the New Testament. In the book of Hebrews, chapters 8 and 9, chapter 12, it talks about you Christians have come to Mount Zion. You have come to the heavenly Jerusalem. You have come to, right? And then Galatians 5 talks about the Jerusalem from heaven, which is Christians, will inherit, but the Jerusalem on earth, which is the Jews who rejected him, will not inherit. And it's all over the New Testament that the New Jerusalem is the kingdom of God in the new covenant of Christ, right?
Yeah.
And so that's obviously, and the funny thing is I love doing this because it's just so, it's right there in the text. I mean, if you go to Revelation 21 and you go, a new heaven and new earth, and I saw the holy city coming out of heaven. Well, okay, anyone can say anything, but when the text itself tells you what it means, then you pretty much have to accept it. Right. And it tells you what it means. Look at further on down. This is Revelation 21. You see right down there in verse 9, he goes, "Come, I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb." Now, I think pretty much every Christian acknowledges that that's the body of Christ is
Absolutely.
The bride of.
Yeah.
And he goes, "He carried me away in the spirit to a great high mountain and showed me the holy city of Jerusalem coming down out of heaven from God." And so he says, "I will show you the bride." And then he says the bride is the holy city Jerusalem coming down from heaven. So he clearly says that the body of Christ is the symbolic New Jerusalem. So if you are a Christian, you are in the New Jerusalem. This is a glorious truth, that we should be more focused on it and appreciative of, rather than thinking, oh no, it's going to come. Oh, that's still in the future, And it's going to come. It's going to be a physical city. Mm-hmm. It's like
right.
no. The spiritual kingdom. It's a spiritual kingdom.
Yeah. With that, we're gonna introduce the next beer, so that way we can everybody catch a quick break. And Gumby, go ahead.
I got you too, man.
Okay, yeah. You know what? Go ahead. You can read it, George.
Yeah, no problem. So we got Sibling Revelry Brewing Company from Westlake, Ohio, which Brian's probably, half hour, 20 minutes from here, not too far.
Yeah.
This is their coffee red, and 5.5 ABV, 35 IBU. And their coffee beans they use from Duck Rabbit Coffee, which is actually right up the road in Ohio City. So that's about 10 minutes from here, 2 minutes from my house.
A modern day version of Buzz Beer.
There you go. Cheers.
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 Straight in the can. It's good enough.
It smells awesome. It has that nice coffee aroma.
Man.
And
Oh,
I
definitely.
love a coffee aroma.
It's something special.
It has a nice amber color. I was actually surprised. Not much head, which a lot of ambers are very heavy on head. This one, not so much.
This is a little bit close to the one in Willoughby Beer.
Oh, my Lord. This is... It's,
A little bit close. Not quite.
It's not quite as dark as that.
No.
Nor as thick. But, man, the flavor's fantastic.
Yeah.
Are you talking about the one that has peanut butter in it?
Yeah, peanut butter coffee.
Yeah, that's good.
Oh, yeah. It's amazing. No question, it's amazing. But this is a nice amber, and I love the flavor of this because the coffee's not overpowering. It's almost subtle. It's definitely there.
Absolutely, yeah.
Oh man, it's really good.
I have a good wife. She bought it for me. She called me. She's like, "Hey, I'm at the store. Do you want anything?"
And it's not hoppy at all.
Yeah.
This is definitely a smooth lager with that nice imbued flavor of coffee.
Oh yeah, this is very well balanced.
Good stuff.
I love coffees, and this one is definitely up there now.
Yeah.
I'm enjoying this.
So am I the only one that didn't know what the word revelry means? Does anyone? Seriously, I'm asking. Does anyone know? You gonna just laugh at me?
Like sibling revelry. When it's
No,
okay, go ahead.
That's all right.
it's not rivalry.
No.
It's revelry.
Oh shoot! I didn't actually read the can.
Yes, yeah.
It
When
is
I actually
revelry.
looked at it,
Oh, look at that!
So what is the definition of
I
it?
didn't look
let's
at the
see.
can.
Brian's pretty smart. Ryan, you want to crack at it?
It means to rejoice in.
Yeah,
Revel-
pretty
revel
good.
in.
Yeah.
Ah.
Google has
Celebrate.
it as lively and noisy festivities, especially when those involve drinking large amount of alcohol.
Oh.
That was a George. Fun fact. The more you know.
Well, thank you, George. I didn't read the can. It does say revelry.
And I'm with you. All the way up until today, I thought it was sibling rivalry.
I thought it was, too.
I've even ordered it at bars before and called it rivalry, but it's not.
That's pretty doggone awesome.
It's a great beer. Really good.
I always thought
It's so
revelry
smooth.
was the
Really is.
the wake up call in the morning for the military.
I'm gonna point something out on.
I'm going to point something out, too, once you're done.
Okay.
Yeah, we're ready.
Please.
Let's go at it. By the way, did I tell you guys that I was born and raised in the northwest suburbs of Chicago?
No, really.
Oh,
Yeah.
Awesome.
Cause you're in Illinois.
No,
No.
we're in Cleveland, Ohio.
Ohio.
Oh, I thought you mentioned Westlake, Illinois.
No, Westlake, Ohio.
Westlake,
Oh,
Ohio.
I'm sorry. I misheard you. Sorry.
Yeah, that's okay.
Still a
Although-
But I'm a
Midwesterner.
Midwestern boy.
Yeah, I do like Chicago. It's funny that you bring up because historically, among all the traditional churches, and when I say traditional, I mean like, Catholic, Orthodox, even Lutheran. Among the traditional branches of Christianity, they've always held to an Amill, even borderline preterist perspective. So it's the modern Christian movement that has taken that into a whole new direction, thanks to all of the your Hal Lindsays.
Dispensationalism. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No, you're right. And I mean, look, I've been in some mild debates and stuff here and there with different guys, and one of the things that I'm not that interested in talking about is whose view is the earliest view in the church and all that, because everyone tries to claim our view is the earliest view in the church. But from what my little reading has shown me was that I have found vestiges of every view going all the way back in the early church. They're not the same.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, obviously we've developed them in different directions, but I've seen pieces of every view in the early church. So, even views that were thinking that, it was all about Israel, becoming a nation again even. And so, but historically speaking, you're right. I think that dispensationalism is the one that has basically, sometime around, I think, what was it, Ryrie's Bible study or whatever. Who was the guy who?
Schofield.
Schofield, yeah. So that was where the dispensationalism started to grow, and now that is one of the most dominant ones. And the heart and soul of that one is it's all about Israel. It's all about God. It's all about God wanting to fulfill His prophecies for Israel. And so the way that they interpret prophecy is that the church is a parenthesis, meaning God's really cares about Israel, but the church has come along and sort of taken over for a while, but then the church is going to be raptured and God can get back to fulfilling prophecy to Israel.
Right.
And what's so, in a way, it's theologically abominable because it actually intrinsically denies the gospel inclusion of the Gentiles into God's people.
Yeah.
It's like, oh yeah, you can be saved, but God really cares about Israel, and it creates two plans of salvation.
Yeah.
Because they see, the church is God's people, but Jews are still God's people, as if Jews are separate from Christians, and so there's two plans of God, two peoples of God, and that is pretty much a denial of the gospel, because the gospel says there's one people of God who are Jews and Gentiles united only in faith.
Right.
Yeah.
So if you don't have faith, Paul says in Romans 9, you are cut off.
Yeah.
And cut off is not, we think of cut off like the cut off of the branch. He uses it as an analogy. But in ancient Israel, the concept of cut off had to do with liturgical separation from the holiness and sacredness of God.
Yeah.
So there's a whole lot more at play in that concept, right?
Yeah.
So you're right. That view has dominated.
Well, and it's sad too, because if you look at it, there's the traditions that were set by the church protected that. Like, because you had people, for example, you had people like Justin Martyr, who had a somewhat millennial view. But even he himself in his letters said, well, even though I see that this is my view, I have to bow to the church because there are far more scholars than I in the church, and they disagree. So, or Origen, for example, who had a lot of, he had a lot of diverse views, but but once again, he had to obey the church because you have this united body, and they all agree on what has to be. And that makes a lot of sense, because a consensus view and those traditions protect the church against things like dispensationalism.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
yeah.
And I agree with you in principle, and I actually, I also am in favor of that sort of respect of the body, but I also do acknowledge that nevertheless, I still believe that the church can be wrong and has been wrong historically. And so there's, I'm a sola scriptura guy, so I do believe that scripture is ultimately over tradition, but I do acknowledge and I admit that nevertheless there's a little bit of meshing in there that makes me uncomfortable, but I have to admit is real, and so I'm willing, I'm willing to admit that sort of messiness,
Yeah.
But I do think that in the end, what we have is the Bible, and I do believe that making your arguments from the Scripture is the best thing to do. If you want to convince anybody, let's put it that way. If you want to convince other Christians, you better make it from the Bible as best as possible, and your historical arguments should support it. But in the end, to me, if your Scripture arguments tend to trump historical arguments because the church has been wrong, and so. Therefore, when I get into some of these debates and that I've had with some dispensationalists and stuff, it's kind of like I don't get into a lot of them. I haven't, but the latest one that I did, it was really interesting because I wasn't sure exactly what he believed. I didn't have a lot of time to research him and all that, but but when we argued, like our debate was, who's the harlot in Revelation, and his belief was the harlot is America in the future. My argument was the harlot is a symbol of the Jewish high priesthood in first century Israel. And what I realized was, because again, I don't spend a lot of time learning all these views of their side because it's I don't know, it's redundant, it's not very interesting, and they're not very biblical. So, but his arguments weren't. I'm like making all these arguments from the Bible, and I was actually expecting him to make some arguments, and he never really did. Well, and it actually surprised me, and I just thought like, wow, if it was me listening to this, I tend to be more convinced, persuaded by someone who can argue from the Bible than someone who could say, well, I think it could be Islam because Islam's really evil and they did this and that. And it's like, in other words, you can exegete from the newspaper or from the Bible. What's it going to be?
Right. Yeah, I got a kind of point on what both of you guys were saying. Tying back, you made a comment and you called dispensationalism a theological abomination.
Yeah.
And I agree with you. However, today, it exists as a theological abomination, but it's also geopolitically advantageous for some.
Yeah.
So, and my point is the ambassador to the UN from Israel to the United Nations is Danny Dayon, and they were going back and forth over settlement issues and whether or not it's legal or not, and they have so many resolutions against the state of Israel that exist today. And what his only argument to that was literally holding up the Bible.
Yeah.
He's like, if you want to argue something, you have to argue this, because he says our deed to the land is right here.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then, you know,
And
how are people supposed to even try to respond to that? You know?
well, yeah, you're exactly right. It's an unarguable. You'll never persuade them because they believe it's God Himself, right?
Mm-hmm.
And which is kind of interesting because I find myself often in the middle of, I actually support Israel because she is a democratic nation, an ally of ours, and surrounded by tyranny and totalitarian regimes who want to destroy her and kill. She's the only nation that anybody wants to actually any nation actually says they want to destroy, right, and get rid of, and genocide and all this against her, like Iran, right? And she's in the middle of a Muslim totalitarian monstrous world of slavery. And so I support anyone who tends to be more democratic and such. So politically, I support them as an American ally and such. And so I'm actually very positive about them, but I don't believe Israel right or wrong. And if if Israel engages in illegal or immoral activities, obviously we should condemn it. But what you're saying is, unfortunately, but I don't believe that Israel has a divine right to the land anymore, because that land has become the earth and the kingdom of God. Jesus now is the king over all the earth, including the land of Israel and such. Yeah. So I find myself, supporting Israel, but when, like you say, when the dispensationalists refuse to face maybe anything that Israel might be doing wrong, because in the end, but God gives them the land. Now you're right. It becomes impossible to argue with people like that because you don't have the same ultimate authority for their ownership, Yeah,
it's their interpretation that dictates that.
Exactly. And what that means is, I think what you're getting at is, the logical conclusion of that is, you have Christians who are justifying a country that sometimes engages in immoral deeds or atrocities, right? And they're justifying it in the name of they're God's people, it's God's land, right? Yeah. God gave it to them. Yeah. And I'm not saying that that's always the case, because I personally believe that Israel, it is their land, because in 1948 and the Balfour Declaration, basically they were allowed to nationally acknowledge they were given the land and national sovereignty, and every nation on the face of the earth basically owns its land from conquering. So, once they've been internationally acknowledged as being, this is their nation, I accept that as an international acknowledgement that this is their land. But again, that's geopolitical. It's political, but it's not divine. It's not a religious right.
Right.
And so therefore, I accept the fact that you can make arguments against what they're doing, if what they're doing is wrong or what have you. So. Yeah, it's really sad.
Well, I know, because a lot of their government leaders firsthand believe that about the Bible, and quite honestly, they could care too less about the New Testament at all.
Yeah,
so,
yeah. Well, or to put it in more frank terms, most of them hate Jesus. Mm-hmm. They hate Messiah, right?
Yeah, right.
And we're talking Israel hates Messiah, and I've heard some of these guys like John Hagee, and they're just talking all these glorious things about how the people of God, Israel and Jews are the people of God, and it's like, well, they hate Jesus. So right. you're actually saying people who hate Jesus are actually saved or God's people, and it's just like, wow. Now that doesn't mean that we should hate Jews, obviously. No. But here's the problem: is whenever you start to hold Israel up to the same moral standards that you would hold any other nation up, including America, right? Dispensationalists then try to use that as a tactic to try to label you anti-Semitic.
Oh yeah.
And I've had that done. I've had that done to me, and it really got me angry. And I put him in his place, and I nailed him. And it's like, this is a horrendous public slander. How dare you say that when just because I am saying Jesus said that the first generation of Jews who killed Messiah would have all the blood of the prophets and be judged, and you're hinting that I'm anti-Semitic. And of course, I never said this to him because we never got enough into the debate. But basically, you're saying Jesus is anti-Semitic, and I wouldn't want to. If you want to do that, go as a Christian, go ahead. I wouldn't want to be in your place.
It's
right?
been done before. It has been done before. But you brought up last time, which, and I never forgot this, which is actually more anti-Semitic, rapture theology, where how many Jews will end up being slaughtered for that theology to work. You know, that theology in and of itself, I think fuels anti-Semitism.
Yeah, and by the way, I did bring that up to this dispensationalist, and I did say that. And basically, the principle is, if you believe that God gives the land to Israel, and you're encouraging Jews, go back because it's your land. It's God gave you the land, so you could go back to the land of Israel. While at the same time, you believe as a dispensationalist that, according to Zechariah 13, 2/3 of the land of Israel are going to be killed in the Great Tribulation. You are knowingly encouraging Jews to go back to a land that you know 2/3 of them will be murdered. Mm-hmm. You're right. That is anti-Semitic, and that's cruelty. I don't believe that's going to happen, and I believe that any murder of Jews, genocide or whatever, is completely abominably evil. And so I'm the one who's really against that. But dispensationalists are actually the ones that are for the destruction of 2/3 of the Jews because of their beliefs. Yeah. And to me, that, like you say, if you look at it with a different viewpoint, you start to realize, well, maybe that is actually what lacks a true moral integrity.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
I want to point out that I really like that poster behind you.
Yeah, that's Chronicles. You can buy that on my website, Godawa.com. Go to the store.
Awesome.
And you can get the poster, Chronicles of the Apocalypse, for only $30. I don't know what it is, $20, $30, whatever.
I like
$7 for shipping.
Yeah.
It's a poppin' poster.
Cool, thanks.
Join us for the rest of the conversation in part 2.